It was an ordinary summer day. A 12-year-old girl named Kylie spent it the way millions of children spend their summers, swimming, laughing, splashing in the warm water of a water park near her home in Arkansas. She'd done it countless times before. There was nothing about that day that seemed dangerous, nothing to fear. But somewhere in that warm water lived something microscopic. And on that day, in a single unlucky moment, water was forced up her nose, and with it, an organism so small she never felt it, so rare most doctors go their entire careers without seeing it, and so lethal that it kills more than 97 of every 100 people it infects. Within days, that organism would be inside her skull, destroying her brain tissue cell by cell, and Kaylee would become the center of a desperate medical race against one of the deadliest infections known to science. This is Dark Diagnosis Files, and this is the story of the brain-eating amoeba. Everything in this account comes from documented medical records, data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and published case reports. This is a rare infection, genuinely rare, and one of the goals of telling this story is to explain it accurately, without fear-mongering. So let's meet the organism itself. Its name is Naegleria fowleri. It is not a bacterium and not a virus. It's an amoeba, a single-celled organism, a tiny blob of life that moves and feeds on its own. And it lives all around the world, in warm, fresh water. Lakes, ponds, rivers, hot springs. Slow-moving warm water, especially in the heat of summer, is its ideal home. It also lives in soil. It's what scientists call a free-living organism. It doesn't need a host to survive. It spends the vast majority of its existence simply living in warm water and mud, feeding on bacteria, completely indifferent to human beings. Most of the time, Naegleria fowleri and humans coexist without any problem at all. Here is something genuinely important to understand, because it prevents needless panic. You cannot be infected by drinking contaminated water. Swallowing it does nothing. Your stomach acid destroys the amoeba harmlessly. Millions of people swim in warm, fresh water every summer, and infections are extraordinarily rare. In the United States, typically fewer than 10 cases in an entire year, sometimes 0. But when the conditions align in exactly the wrong way, this harmless pond dweller becomes one of the most efficient killers in all of medicine. The key is the nose, specifically water being forced up into the nasal passages. The kind of thing that happens when you dive, dunk your head, jump into water, or get water shot up your nose during vigorous swimming or water sports. When water containing the amoeba is forced high up into the nose, Naegleria fowleri encounters something almost no other pathogen exploits: a direct highway to the brain. At the very top of the nasal cavity sits the olfactory nerve, the nerve responsible for your sense of smell, and the thin bone it passes through, the cribriform plate. The amoeba attaches to the nasal tissue, and then it travels. It migrates up along the olfactory nerve, crosses that thin plate of bone, and enters the brain directly, bypassing nearly every defense the body would normally throw at an invader entering through the bloodstream. It takes a shortcut straight into the one organ we most need to protect, and once it arrives, it begins to feed. This single detail, that the nose is the only meaningful route of infection, explains almost everything about who gets sick and who doesn't. The typical victim is not someone who drank bad water. It is, overwhelmingly, a young, healthy person doing something vigorous in warm, fresh water in the heat of summer, diving, cannonballing, wrestling with friends, riding water slides, doing anything that drives water forcefully up the nose. Children and teenagers are disproportionately represented among cases, not because their bodies are weaker, but simply because they are the ones most likely to be aggressively playing in exactly the warm, shallow, still water where the amoeba thrives, in exactly the way that forces water high into the nasal passages. The infection is, in a heartbreaking way, a disease of summer fun. A still, dark expanse of warm water under a summer sun, sunlight filtering down into murky depths. What the amoeba does next is the source of its horrifying nickname. Naegleria fowleri, in the brain, does something it doesn't normally do in a pond. Deprived of its usual food, surrounded instead by the richest tissue in the body, it begins consuming brain cells. It literally eats brain tissue, destroying it as it multiplies. This is the origin of the term brain-eating amoeba. It is not a metaphor. The organism causes an infection called primary amoebic meningoencephalitis, or PAM, a rapid, catastrophic destruction and inflammation of the brain, As the amoeba feeds and multiplies, the brain responds with massive inflammation and swelling. And here is the ultimate cause of death in most cases. The brain, swelling inside the rigid, unyielding box of the skull, has nowhere to expand. The rising pressure crushes the brain against and through the base of the skull. It is this swelling, this catastrophic pressure, that most often kills. There is something almost uniquely cruel about the biology of this. Most deadly infections give the body a chance. The immune system detects the invader in the blood, mounts a defense, buys time, but Naegleria's route up the olfactory nerve delivers it into the brain almost stealthily, and once inside, it is shielded from much of the body's normal immune response by the very barrier that protects the brain. The organism that eats brain tissue is, for a critical window, partly hidden from the defenses that might otherwise fight it. By the time the body mounts its full inflammatory response, that response itself, the swelling, becomes part of what kills the patient. The brain is caught between the amoeba destroying it from within and the pressure of its own defensive reaction. The timeline is brutally fast. Symptoms typically begin within about 1 to 9 days after exposure, often around 5 days. And in the cruelest twist of all, the early symptoms are almost indistinguishable from something far more common and far less dangerous. The first signs are a severe headache, fever, nausea, and vomiting. To any parent and to many doctors, this looks like the flu or a summer bug or ordinary bacterial meningitis. There is no reason, in those first hours, to suspect that a microscopic amoeba is eating the patient's brain. Carly's own mother initially thought her daughter's terrible headache was from too much sun or dehydration. Why would she think anything else? But then the symptoms escalate, and they escalate fast. Stiff neck, sensitivity to light, confusion, loss of balance, seizures, hallucinations. And by the time these severe neurological symptoms appear, the infection is usually so advanced that it is almost always too late. In most documented cases, death comes within about 5 days to 2 weeks of the first symptoms. The speed is one of the reasons it is so lethal. The window to diagnose and treat it is agonizingly narrow. Which brings us back to Carly and to why her case became so important. When Kaylee was brought to Arkansas Children's Hospital with a high fever and vomiting, she was gravely ill. But something went right that goes wrong in most cases. Her doctors identified the enemy fast. Examining her cerebrospinal fluid, the liquid around the brain and spinal cord, they found the amoebas themselves. They knew what they were fighting. And that early identification brought them the one thing this infection almost never allows: a fighting chance. Her medical team threw everything at it. They used a cocktail of powerful antifungal and antimicrobial drugs, a regimen refined from the very few prior survival cases. And crucially, they added 2 things. One was an experimental drug called miltefosine, a medication originally developed for other purposes, including breast cancer and a parasitic disease, that had shown an ability to kill the amoeba in the lab. It had been tried once before on a young patient who did not survive, but it represented real hope. The second measure was therapeutic hypothermia, deliberately cooling Kaylee's body below normal temperature. This is a technique sometimes used in severe brain injury. The logic was twofold. Cooling might slow the amoeba's ability to reproduce, buying the drugs time to work, and it might reduce the catastrophic brain swelling that is the primary cause of death. A dim intensive care unit, the soft rhythmic sounds of a ventilator, a child small and still beneath cooling equipment, machines standing guard. For weeks, Kaylee fought for her life on a ventilator. In intensive care, her brain under siege, her survival uncertain from hour to hour. And then, against staggering odds, the amoebas began to disappear from her spinal fluid. The drugs, the cooling, the speed of diagnosis and factors doctors still don't fully understand combined to do what almost never happens. They stopped the infection. After 55 days in the hospital and a long road of rehabilitation, Carly Hardig walked out alive, one of the very few documented survivors of Naegleria fowleri infection in the entire history of the United States, and she made a full neurological recovery. It's worth dwelling on how astonishing that recovery was, because survival from this infection has often meant survival with devastating, permanent brain damage. Carly not only lived, she went back to school, back to a normal childhood, her mind and personality intact. Her doctors were, by their own accounts, amazed. Years later, she has spoken publicly about her experience, a living reminder that even the most lethal diagnoses are not always absolute, and that the combination of luck, speed, and relentless medical effort can occasionally pull someone back from a place almost no one returns from. Her mother has credited the doctors with giving her daughter back to her. Her survival was so rare that her case and the protocol used to treat her became a template. When a teenage boy in Florida contracted the infection a few years later, doctors treated him using the approach refined from Kaylee's case, and he too survived. Every survivor teaches medicine a little more about how to fight something that, for decades, was almost universally a death sentence. But we have to be honest about the numbers because they are sobering. Kaylee is one of a mere handful of survivors. Since the 1960s, of the more than 150 documented cases in the United States, over 97% have been fatal. One of the few other survivors suffered permanent, severe brain damage because treatment began too late. The difference between Kaylee and the many who did not survive often came down to a matter of hours, how fast the infection was recognized and attacked. That is the terrible core of this disease. It is not that it can't be fought. It's that it moves faster than our ability to recognize it, disguised as a summer headache until it is too late. But since the amoeba enters through the nose, and only through the nose, there are simple, sensible precautions that reduce an already small risk even further. But since the amoeba enters through the nose, and only through the nose, there are simple, sensible precautions that reduce an already small risk even further. Avoid forcing water up your nose in warm, still fresh water, especially in the peak heat of late summer. Hold your nose shut, or use a nose clip when jumping or diving into warm lakes and ponds. Avoid stirring up the sediment at the bottom of shallow warm water where the amoeba concentrates. And if you use a neti pot or do nasal rinses, never use untreated tap water. Use distilled, sterile, or properly boiled and cooled water. Because in extremely rare cases, contaminated tap water forced into the nose has caused infection. And perhaps most important of all, if someone develops a severe headache, fever, and a stiff neck within a week or two of swimming in warm fresh water, tell the doctor about that swim. That single piece of information, mentioning the water exposure, could be what prompts the fast diagnosis that, as Kaylee's case proved, can be the razor-thin difference between life and death. Naegleria fowleri is a reminder of something this channel returns to again and again, that the natural world contains genuine, documented horrors, and that our best defense against them is not fear, but understanding. The amoeba doesn't hunt us, it's just an organism doing what it does, in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Knowing how it works is how we rob it of its worst power. If real medical cases like this one grip you, please take a moment to subscribe to Dark Diagnosis Files. We investigate the rare, the lethal, and the genuinely documented at the edges of medicine, always grounded in the real record, and always told with the seriousness it deserves. Your subscription is what keeps this channel going. This is a real, documented account. Every detail is sourced from confirmed medical records, CDC data, and published case reports. Dark Diagnosis Files investigates the horror that happens around hospitals and medicine. New cases every Sunday, Tuesday, and Friday. Real, documented, told with the gravity they deserve. It lives in the warm water we swim in every summer, and it asks only for one unlucky moment and one way in.